Welcome to STEAM Powered, where I have conversations with women in STEAM to learn a little bit about what they do and who they are. I'm your host, Michelle Ong. My guest today is Dr. Audrey Lobo-Pulo. Audrey is a liminal technologist who is passionate about how technology may be designed for better government and societal outcomes, and how information evolves and flows within society. Join us as we talk about context and resilience, and how we approach living systems. Welcome, Audrey. Thank you so much for joining me on STEAM Powered. It is wonderful to have you on the show today, speaking with me about all the amazing stuff that you're doing with, policy, data, AI. It's absolutely amazing.
I'm so happy and so excited to be here, Michelle. I think part of the excitement of this journey and this conversation will be seeing where the next step will take us and exploring some of these topics around data and AI and policy. So yeah, let's go.
Amazing. Cool. Well, we'll get started with, where you started with your journey. And, you're in policy and data now, but you started off in physics. So how did you start in physics, and, what motivated you to do that?
It's a big question, Michelle, and it's something that I've been reflecting back on my own journey in science and tech. And as a child, I was always very curious about nature and the world around me. And so what I hadn't realized at the time was that there was a very definite fork in the road for me. And one was around understanding nature in terms of the creatures on the planet and living systems, which I didn't end up going down that path. And the other was understanding, the phenomena in nature around light and watching the waves break on a beach and trying to understand the patterns in that. And so for me, physics was all about really finding my way to becoming close to nature and understanding nature. And so that was where the love of that topic sort of started. And, when I started at school, they were probably, an equal kind of a mix in terms of the gender balance between males and females doing physics. But when I got into university, as I was saying, I was just one of two or three women in a class of around 50 to 60. And so,
Yeah.
that's where I really noticed that there was a bit of a gender imbalance. And it hadn't really dawned on me at that time in terms of, understanding why women weren't sort of, being gravitating to the sciences and the physics and the tech. But it was certainly something that, more recently has become a passion of mine.
I think everyone's becoming so much more aware about these issues that we're facing, and we're starting to see our peers and our colleagues either, going sideways or, changing fields entirely. And, it's not it's not a new phenomena, but, as we progress in our careers, we start to become more, aware of all of that happening.
Yeah, exactly. And, I was I loved physics. And so I was, tunneling down this path. I did my PhD in optical fibers and, really understanding the way light behaves and thinking about signals and transmission. And at the time, it would have been the early 2000s. So back then, the dot-com bust was a big thing. There's a lot of hype around that. And so it was a really exciting space to be in. Spent a bit of time in physics and then thought to myself, at the time in Australia, there weren't that many roles in terms of jobs and employment for someone who had done a course in theoretical physics. So I was like, well, I have two choices. I either stay in Australia or I moved to the US. And at the time I chose to stay and wanted to then sort of, find new ways to use the skills that I had honed in and the love that I had for, mathematics and modeling. And I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to start my career as a graduate at the Australian Federal Treasury. And the work that I started doing was around modeling labour force projections and, really understanding Australia's labour market, our demographics, and using some of the models that I had been trained in a different context. So using it from a public policy context. And so for me, kind of like, marching into this role, I kind of felt like, oh, I get the tech side, I get the data side, I get the modeling side. But what I was completely unprepared for was this gap in understanding that the way models work and the paradigm that models are built on is actually quite different to the everyday experience from what we see in society. And so, having
Yeah.
to come from what has been traditionally known as the hard sciences to then a world where there are behavioral impacts, and the way people react to certain
Mm.
policies don't often go along what your model has predicted. And so for me, that was a bit of
Yes.
a shock. It was like, why am I creating these models that aren't really, what can I do
Why
better?
aren't humans behaving the way I expect them to?
Exactly. And so, there's a deficiency in my model. And that was the thinking at the time. My thinking at the time was like, look,
Yeah.
no model's going to be good enough. We're just going to have to keep improving the model till we asymptotically kind of reach this perfection. And how wrong was I?
Yeah.
It was this striving that, we had to have more terms, we had to have more data, we had to have more assumptions. The models needed to be better. And this quest
Yes.
for perfecting the models without realizing that all this while I was actually creating what Alfred Korzybski, I think, I can't remember his last name, says that we're creating maps, and the map is not the territory. Korzybski, I think his name is.
Mm.
And so I was so focused on the map, trying to mimic the territory, that I hadn't realized about, of the value that was embedded in that territory. So, and that was another journey of in and of itself.
Yes, absolutely. Because there's so many moving parts, so many factors involved in all the models. Like I was speaking to a statistician a while ago, and she was part of this wider consortium talking about COVID modeling and disease spread. And you can model it all that you like in the way that you think diseases have to spread, but it depends on the terrain, it depends on the people, it depends on the way they interact, the cultural factors. So, people who aren't in high contact cultural environments are going to spread it a little bit differently to ones who are. People in urban environments and densely populated areas are going to be spreading it differently, because you also have to consider infrastructure, your roads, your air conditioning, the way that people handle all these other aspects of living in urban environments. And it's all about the context, and you can't apply one to everywhere else. It's just not going to work.
So now you've got me really excited when you mentioned the word context, because this has, been something that I've been orbiting over the last couple of years. And let me tell you a little bit more about,
Yeah.
that journey. And so, this
Yes.
quest with understanding data and getting more and more data, and we're now getting to the point where big data is not a thing anymore. It used to be a thing like 15 years ago. Now everyone kind of takes it for granted that there's all
Yeah.
this big data, and everyone's going to be able to model everything to perfection. But what's been interesting from my, some of my work has been understanding what that data actually means, not just from a insights perspective. So from a, what does this data tell us about a certain problem that we're trying to solve, but what exactly is the data? So, and it's almost
Yes.
like I had to come full circle back to being the child that I was when I was interested in data and nature. And it's like, okay, measurement was a really cool thing, right? Like, you get out your ruler and your angles and you measure things. And for the most part, everyone in the room kind of agreed that a right angle was a right angle. And there wasn't, too much disagreement about that. But when it came to things like
Yeah.
how people feel about, a certain political event or an incident that had
Mm-hmm.
happened, people's views started like continually change. And it's not just that there's
Yes.
different points of opinion. It's also that the same person can change their opinion over time. And so, having an
Yes.
understanding about what exactly is data um, then got me
Mm-hmm.
thinking about what is objectivity versus subjectivity, because they're both types of information, right?
Yes.
So we have objective information,
Right.
information that I would argue has less variability. So things like, okay, what's the temperature today? You know, most of us would kind of agree that the
Yep.
temperature right now is whatever it is, but other questions may not be something that we all kind of agree on. And that information, one would argue, again, by definition, it's more subjective. So um, here we have two different types of information. And it's not just two, there's various degrees of subjectivity and objectivity. And how do we think about that when we use that kind of data in models? What happens to that
Mm-hmm.
information? Is that data alive? And by alive, what I mean by that is, we could think about data that's about societal attitudes to women, for example, back, in the 1940s and 50s, and use that data to train,
Mm-hmm.
AI algorithms. But if we then apply those models to today, you can see that that
Yes.
context piece is missing, right? So it's like, how much
Mm-hmm.
weight do we put on that information? And when we model, we talk about weighting different parameters differently. But the big thing for me around all of this is, understanding the context and the various number of contexts that come into play when it comes to data, because data is like,
Yes.
it's decontextualized information. It's information that we have
Mm.
we have gathered by virtue of measurement, right?
Yes.
So we've chosen to measure a particular attribute.
Yes. And it's true at that point in time. And, once it's taken out of that context, yeah, it doesn't grow. It doesn't give you more information about what has happened in that period to the various data points that you've collected.
Yeah, exactly. And the other piece around that, which
Yeah.
I find fascinating, is the ecosystem around that data. So everyone's kind of heard,
Mm-hmm.
the phrase "data is the new oil." That's one that's been peddled around quite
Yes.
frequently. But I love the idea of thinking about data as an apple. An apple that you have harvested from an ecosystem and a context, but the apple isn't the tree. And the apple has
Yep.
interdependencies. That data depends, the apple around that data depends on the soil around that tree, the birds that have been, that have sort of pecked away at that particular apple, and how that apple has been influenced by the ecosystem around it. And so that is missing information, right? That we haven't collected
Mm-hmm.
when we harvest data, or when we, point in time or place measure information about something.
Yes.
I'd even go so far as to say that even the way we anchor data to a thing is really fascinating. So, concrete example, I was reading this really interesting article by Chris Hildrey around homelessness. So he did this really
Mm-hmm.
interesting piece of work where what they found was that homeless people weren't able to get their social benefits because they had no address. Um, and so
Mm-hmm.
this concept that, for someone who's a person to get um, a subsidy or some kind of monetary benefit required a third, an address as being, a piece of
Yep.
information or data, not about the person, but about where the person resides. And so what we've done is we've anchored
The,
the
yes.
payment to data that's connected to an address, not a person. So, how do we, when we think
Mm-hmm.
about data and how that data is anchored to whether it be a person or a thing, um, how are we anchoring data, and what are the implications around
Yes. Absolutely. There are so many of these systems that make so many assumptions about an individual situation, and they aren't always in concert with what they're trying to connect the data for.
we could even look at it from an ethics perspective, right? So, one of the examples that I've been
Yes.
playing with is this idea that when we have data around, say, let me give you an example, workplace injuries and incidents.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
that injury is usually attributed to the individual that has experienced that injury, right? And
Hmm.
so if you look at a situation where you're doing some modeling around, behaviors of employees and which employees are more likely to leave an organization or stay within an organization, and one of the metrics you collect is specific to injuries in the workplace, one could argue
Hmm.
that if the modeling shows that people with injuries in the workplace are more likely to leave, that then brings on a whole range of ethical questions around, will employers terminate
Yes.
their employment prior to them
Yes.
like, how do we deal with those really tricky situations? Now, if we think about anchoring it a
Mm.
different way, and I'd love to actually do some work around this in my copious amounts of spare time. Um, if we actually anchored that injury to the place at which it happened, so it could be that it's not the individual as much
Yes.
as it is a particular setup or room within an organization that is more
Mm.
prone to these incidents happening, and of course that can be picked up. Um,
Yes.
but then we can sidestep the ethical issues around having these individuals disclose information that could potentially harm their own careers. So how
Yeah.
do we address issues in the workplace without by anchoring data differently so that we can sidestep some of those ethical issues rather than mitigate them down the track?
Yeah. And adds a little bit more objectivity to the data.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
this kind of thinking about different ways of anchoring information is something that I think we don't do enough of. And partly because, look,
Mm.
a lot of people are just wanting to create models that predict things that are able to, deliver certain outcomes. And so we don't pay enough
Yes.
attention, in my opinion, to not just the quality of the data, because that's a separate issue, but how we um,
Mm.
recontextualize that information and do some checks and balances around whether we're anchoring the data appropriately. I once got into a really interesting discussion, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, Michelle, around with a friend around, and this was the story. Um,
Yep.
they, a particular local government, and not mentioning any names, collected a whole lot of data on homelessness, again, homeless people,
Hmm.
and a whole bunch of other metrics. And they found these people housing that they thought was suitable. And for some reason, a lot of them accepted the housing that was offered, but there were some individuals that didn't. And so the understanding, and the general sentiment around that was these people being a bit difficult. Why aren't they accepting, that accommodation? There should be no logical reason why they wouldn't get out of that situation. And what they found, when
Hmm.
they started speaking to the social workers on the ground, was that these particular individuals had pets, and their pets for them were like family because they were often estranged from their actual families. And the housing that was
Yes.
offered to them did not allow for pets. So these individuals
Mm.
would rather be homeless um, with their pets than accept
Yes.
housing that was made available to them that didn't allow for pets. Now,
Mm.
one could argue that having that sort of tacit understanding of the situation could have produced a better model. But if you were model focused, you
Mm.
would say, well, had you had a metric that was focused on whether or not the individual had pets, you would have picked up, um, you know, that as being a parameter in the actual modeling. And so, we kind of
Yep.
come into this chicken and egg situation, which is how much of the situation can be explained by data, but how much of it could be
Yes.
explained even before we started the modeling process by actually understanding the knowledge pieces around
Absolutely. No. It's there's it's a project management meme that goes around every now and then. It's used a lot in technology, and it's called the tire swing problem. So I'm not sure if you heard about it.
No, I'd love to hear
Um,
more.
the So it's usually a series of cartoons, and it talks about what the marketing person wants, and there's this fantastic theme park with a tire swing involved, but It's very detailed, very over the top, provides so many bells and whistles. And then it's like, okay, so the engineer designs it a different way, but it's impractical, but fulfills the requirements to the letter. And it goes through all these different types of roles of people coming up with what they think the solution is supposed to be. And all that was actually needed was a rope attached to a tire attached to a tree, and that was it, because that's what the customer wanted, and that's what they needed. So it's people make all these assumptions like, this is a problem we have to solve, this is what I think it's going to be, but there's no systems gathering or systems understanding. There's no understanding about the actual requirements, about the people, the end users, or whoever it is who needs to use the product or the facility at the end. And it's people taking their own assumptions, their own biases, and applying it to situations for people who are not in the same circumstance that they're in at all, and not understanding any of it. It's just one of those quirky things where people, just you don't communicate, you don't understand the system, and um, you don't have the context for the way that you want your solution to be designed.
Yeah, and so the thing that comes to mind with that story is this idea of human in the loop when it comes to designing
Yeah.
systems. So my view on this has been that we don't want the human in the loop. We want the human all the way, right? As an equal partner to
Yeah.
technology. So it's not that tech does
Hmm.
its piece and then we go to the human and now we go back to tech. Um, it's bigger than that. It's about embedding.
Hmm.
It's almost like finding the right synergy between the way humans think, which may not be completely rational, and having the technology sort of really um, you know complement complement that piece. And I know there've been many people talking about how are humans going to work better with technology? Will technology take over the
Hmm.
tasks that humans do in every aspect of what we're able to produce?
Yeah,
And so that's an interesting discussion in and of itself. But one of the
it is.
things, one of the so on my journey, I came across the work of Nora Bateson, who's the president of the International Bateson Institute, and her father did a lot of work as well. Gregory Bateson, who was an anthropologist, um, around understanding natural living systems. And so, what was fascinating for me was that I had like made a choice and gone down this modeling physics kind of path, and completely ignored that natural living system, that biology, the understanding, in terms of the interrelationships of how we depend on each other, our environment, and how the systems around us shape us. And so Nora
Yes.
has this concept which she calls warm data, which is, in my understanding, information across many contexts. So it's what she calls transcontextual. Um, the apple on the tree, has a nutritional context, but it also has a monetary context in terms of the pricing around it. So having an understanding, of not just the individual context around that information, but how these contexts then start interacting with one another. That is that transcontextual piece that I think, can't be measured because there's so many different
Yes.
takes on that. And so
Absolutely.
part of my work has been understanding the role that warm data plays alongside the cold data, what I called cold data, meaning information that's a lot more objective, as opposed to cold data, which is something that is more subjective. Um, I could hear like if I went out into the garden and I got a couple of flowers, you could say, okay, those are a bunch of flowers. They're yellow. They're sunflowers. They were planted at this time, at this date. What other information can you possibly get? But what might not be obvious to anyone else would be, I had a connection with my grandmother who loved gardening. And so for me, that represents nurture. It represents connection to family. And so, as humans, I wonder we all come together, bringing our own pieces of information to contextualize what we're seeing in the world around us. And um,
Yes.
how do we, what are we bringing to the objective data that's in front of us, that is then goes on to shape our decision making, and how do we then
Yes.
create the right conditions for us to start understanding one another, because we're acknowledging the subjective information in the room. So often, when it comes to modeling and it comes to analytics, we tend to put the subjective aside, and we do that for a really legitimate reason, and that is it's not
Yes.
verified, it can't be tested, right? Like if I did an experiment like I did at school where I took a ball to the top floor and I drop it, I can actually time it, and objectively we could all come up with what the gravitational constant's going to be like. But if you give me something subjective, it's like, well, why would we bother do that? Because we can't keep testing that and verify. And the whole point of science is to build, right? So
Yeah.
if we all come to an agreement on
Yes. To
something,
build, to
that
test, to
then forms the
verify. Yeah.
foundation for the next thing. And so in doing
Yes.
that, that gives us confidence, because we're like, well, we've verified that, we've proved this, and we've taken it to the next level and the next level. But by ignoring the subjective, because it's just all too hard and uncomfortable, and we don't want to deal with that, we're actually throwing out information, really valuable information that
We
we
are.
need for the actual problem.
We are. And because you have to collect all this information, it's a lot of it, and big data gets bigger once you add all of this warm data to it. And at what point do you say this is enough warm data for us to provide what we need to develop our solution? Because you don't know at what point the data points become too loose for the model you're trying to develop, because it's subjective. Like with the dogs for developing the houses, like, did you know that you should have collected information about their other relationships, or their other uh, behaviors or habits that might prevent them from taking up that offer? At what point do you say this information is no longer relevant?
Yeah, and big questions there, right? Like, what we're talking about essentially is the viability of data. How viable is this data set to solve this problem? And who could potentially answer that question? So, in the world that I studied if we talk about even, the mechanics of physics, that data is fairly unchanging. Like it won't really change over time, and gravitational constant's kind of the same. But if you talk about political sentiment, that has a whole range of different contexts to it. There's the health context, and
Yes.
the workplace context. There is the economic context and the environmental context. So all these factors are sort of shaping the way we see the world. We all see the world quite differently, and I think it's also about understanding how other contexts that may not seem relevant at first glance can actually impact areas like economics, health, and so forth. We've all kind of and still are living through this pandemic, and the biggest things have been how something that's a shock in the health sector has impacted the economic sector, has impacted the family, people's family arrangements and their work from home arrangements. So it's like having these shocks in one context has implications for a whole range of other contexts. One example that I'm currently sort of just tossing and trying to understand better has been looking at this idea, and particularly with open source software. How did open source software become so big? And the reason, if you look at how it all started, and I'm sure you already know the story, was that someone wanted access to code that was not available, and so they decided to do it themselves. But the way they were able to get open source to really grow was to use the legal context by creating a copyleft license, right? So for me, what's so
Yes.
fascinating about this is that a problem that was identified in an economic context and a productivity context was able to be solved from a legal context by being really clever about the way certain licenses were created around that software to enable it to grow rather than, you know, kept kept only to certain individuals. So how do we then try and look at the problems we have today and the data that we have today from different contexts? Because that could be where the
Yes.
solution is.
Absolutely. And you're seeing that there's so many other perspectives, so many other views, so many other contexts informing other fields, other areas, other, industries these days, because they're able to approach it in a way that hasn't previously been done. It gives you, it's literally looking outside the box to find alternative ways to solve problems. And, people, it's great to see that people are starting to apply more of these open source principles and trying to figure out similar avenues, if not, you can't use identical ones, but similar avenues to approach things from the side. And yeah, but it again creates other issues, other social, economic, and it ripples out to create all these other impacts.
Yeah, and so I think, from a tech perspective, what I find really curious is that, we often think about building these models or technologies and then trying to understand the impacts that will then roll out from these technologies, which is great.
Yep.
But why don't we start thinking about it from an ecosystem perspective? Why don't we start thinking
Yep.
about how the technologies we build are influenced by the environment and the context that we already have? So, why don't we start
Mm-hmm.
thinking about information that's flowing in both directions? So it's not just we build X and here's the impact from that. Why don't we ask the question, how do we build X in the context of all these other pieces, right? In the context of environment, in the
Yes.
context of health. How do we think about building technologies, not necessarily to solve problems, which it's great at doing, but how do we even design the tech in a way that's informed by these other pieces that come together?
Yes. And that's leading us into the way that we use AI, right? Because a lot of it is we use AI to build these models, to create these systems, to solve these problems, to predict these behaviors. But again, it's without the context, and we need to be able to think, okay, well, we need to design it backwards. So we need to see the social impact, the economic impact, and kind of work backwards from that to try and give it a more holistic view.
Absolutely. And how does how does the systems, because ultimately the systems and the blueprint, I kind of call it the blueprint of the systems, exist in the data, right? So if there is
Mm,
inequality, it shows up in the data and it's embedded in the data, which is
yes.
why we have these biases and these issues. And so again, we get into this chicken and egg thing, which is, okay, it's not the algorithms that's the problem, it's society that's the issue. So that's got to be fixed before we can sort out better outcomes for these algorithms. But even understanding that actually
But it's
it's
so
not
backwards
fixing one
thinking it
and
that
the
way.
others, right? It's how do we
Yeah.
think of them as a system, um,
Mm,
where we're not just fixing individual fragments of that system, but we're considering the system as a whole. Um, one of the one of the pieces of work that I was really interested in was about how you design for more robust systems, and more resilient systems. And there's been a bit of work and research done um, that suggests that if you design systems for the vulnerable, that is actually the most resilient system, because the system has give and flexibility within it to accommodate not just the
mm,
vulnerable, but external shocks that might affect the people who are not vulnerable today. Um, Rather
yes.
than let's design a system and then slap onto the end of that something that allows the vulnerable to use it, or people so it's not retrofitting this to make things more equitable. It's about how you design it in the first
Mm,
place, not just from a moral perspective that it's the right thing to do, but understanding that that's actually the more resilient solution in all of this. How do we
It
create,
is. But
um, build in technologies that are more resilient by virtue of them being
mm,
able to adapt more quickly?
absolutely. And if you're able to catch the usual, segment that falls through the gaps, you're by nature going to be able to catch everyone else along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a
Yeah.
it's sort of, you really need to think about it, right? Like
Yeah.
it's having that understanding that building systems that accommodate the vulnerable is actually beneficial for us because we don't know what's
Mm,
coming ahead and what the shocks are. So how do we build and design more
yes.
inclusive technologies, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's actually the more resilient and more robust, um, way forward?
Little segue. So we're talking at some point, we're learning a bit more about the food bank and the systems around the food bank and the services they offer. And they made the point to express that people aren't always in situations where they are vulnerable, but sometimes they have periods where they are vulnerable, and you need to be able to support those people as well because they might not be consistently in that environment, but they still equally need the support because, like you said, they're shocks. Sometimes people fall in rough times and they know it's not going to be a permanent situation. You need to give them the support as well to be able to get back on their feet. And that's why we need to develop the systems to support the vulnerable, to support the people who might fall into those gaps from time to time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a big one.
It is a big one. And it's still, all of it is about systems development to support our society in different ways. And so it might be infrastructure related, it might be tech related, it might, be, anything, but it's still part of a wider system with multiple moving parts.
Yeah. And I think and this is sort of taking that idea and bringing that context piece back into it, which is understanding how
Mm,
designing systems is very contextual. And that may sound
mm,
obvious, but when we think about AI and how it's deployed, we talked about this example where if you had training data around around societal attitudes to women back in the 1950s and applied them today, may not be the best model to use. But we don't think too deeply around whether we use um, data that's trained in, say, Western countries that then gets deployed to,
mm,
Africa or India. Um, what does that mean in terms of the outcomes for those kinds of people? And we're not even going into the race,
yeah.
you know, algorithms that are trained based on different races. And so having an understanding, not just about the data that's being used for training, but from a rigorous, if you want to talk about model rigor, like from a rigorous perspective, um, how viable is that data? So we're going back to not just data quality in terms of measurement, but the viability
Mm,
of data. Is that data viable to solve, a problem that has a completely different context? And where is the threshold?
yeah.
So, at what point does the data go from being useful as a predictor for a model to then being rubbish, right? And what about that gray area in
Yes.
between where we're not
Mm,
quite so sure whether that's an appropriate it is appropriate to use these technologies. So I think I'm not anti AI because I love data and I love models, but I think we need to spend more time thinking about when it is appropriate to be using models and when it isn't appropriate to use them. Um, and
yes.
finding the right balance in that. I mean, just because we have a hammer, it doesn't mean everything's a nail.
Things a nail. Exactly. And yeah, as we said, like the circumstances that we apply, the context that we apply these AI algorithms to are also constantly changing. So, the algorithm also needs to adapt. the way that people literally physically move around the globe, the globalization context, the fact that, different parts of local environments have different cultural divisions, just because people hang around their own people, because it's just, commonality and finding, um, I guess, common grounds. So, it's, having to make sure that these algorithms account for the fact that people are people and do peoply things.
And having the complexity that people often bring. When we talk about different contexts, I often, one of the things that I've often sort of run into is this idea that we need to make things simple for people to understand.
Mm.
And it's something that I used to buy into until I really started studying complexity. And I no longer, I no longer subscribe to that view. Let me give you an example. I
Yeah.
think that, we've come to a situation right now in the political environment where slogans, political slogans are very simplified. And when they become really simplified,
Yes.
what we're seeing is that there's a lot more polarization in public opinion. And I
lose
kind of
nuance
feel,
by oversimplifying.
yeah, and I kind of feel that's because we've stripped out that context. We've decontextualized these really, important and complex issues into something that people find really hard to make sense of. And so, you could simplify political campaign slogans so that people get a sense of what's going on. But what you're essentially doing is you're robbing them of the ability to make sense of that situation for themselves by taking away. And we've spoken about information and information that can be collected, that can't be collected, like raw data, information around context, which is missing from AI, for example. But even in discussions, when we strip out context from information, what we're left with is less avenues by which people can start joining the dots, because there's not that many dots to join anymore. And so their own sense making as being part of that process is severely hindered by us not providing that context. So, my view is, rather than us running away from complexity, we need to embrace complexity. We need to start thinking about, issues in their gory complexity, which is part of the wild, right? Understanding that, for example, migration is also a work issue, is also a family issue, has, all these different layers and contexts around that. And so that, people then have the choice, because they're given that information, to make sense for themselves, rather than, governments, and I'm not saying governments are doing that, but rather than this thinking that we need to simplify things so that people understand things that are complex.
Yeah. And because you take away those layers that would help provide the information they need to be more informed, and you end up with a lot more arguments online. But how do we go about trying to solve that problem now that we're this far down the rabbit hole?
I don't know if we can solve that problem, Michelle. Look, I feel like, so here's a little bit of a project. I'll tell you a little bit about a project I did with the Canadian National Energy Regulator, and that was around understanding citizen engagement, civic engagement on digital platforms. And what we found was, when we spoke to citizens and said, hey, can you tell us what you think about these really important political issues online? A lot of them would say, we're not really, not really interested. We've got so many other things to do. We don't have the time to talk to government. But
That's
then
your
they
job.
would, but then they'd go online and have conversations on platforms that, were very much what government wanted to engage on. And so the question then is, we've got a disengagement with government around these issues. And conversations are now being polarized and shaped in ways that, governments had no idea going to happen. And before you know it, you've got an issue that government has to deal with. So we did a bit of research 2 years ago and we presented it in New York, and that was around, what are the conditions that are required for citizens to engage with government online? And how do we create, again, we kind of
Hmm.
took an ecosystem approach. How do we create the right conditions so that people can have a constructive conversation about a really a tricky issue? So it could be something like putting energy pipelines in certain areas. How do we get, how do we have a dialogue that's somewhat constructive in the public domain? And what are the pieces needed for this? And it was fascinating because the research suggests that people need to feel empowered, and that
Hmm.
means the ability to be able to have a voice. So they don't necessarily always want a voice. Sometimes people are okay with just knowing that if they wanted to say something, they could. So
Yes.
having silence is okay, but still providing people the opportunity to reach out. And for people to
Hmm.
really know that they're being heard. Again, it doesn't mean that government has to necessarily agree with everything that everyone says. And people get that. People understand. The research shows that people don't mind if government makes a decision that goes against what they've said, so long as they feel that it's been properly considered, and that they've
Yes.
really been listened to. And so, how do we,
Mm.
rethink this idea of consensus and how we achieve consensus? Is consensus everybody agreeing to a particular viewpoint? Because that's never going to happen.
No.
And so, what exactly then is consensus? Is it the process by which an agreement is reached, rather than an outcome? And also understanding that consensus means that there may be other points of consensus. So it's not consensus about a particular issue A. We might find that issue C, D, and E have a general consensus, and then how do we build from that? So some really interesting work that was being done by the Taiwanese government around how do they find places where the public do have consensus and build from that, and they've been using machine learning to identify those points of consensus. So really flipping the problem on its head and
Yes.
saying we're not just looking for consensus on issue A, but we've presented the issue in its complexity, and we're allowing the system to start, or we're allowing points of consensus to start emerging from this system. And how do we then work with that?
Yes.
So, a really different approach, right?
It is, and it's great because I saw the article you wrote about that system and how if you can find the points of consensus, even if it's not the issue you're talking about, you can still figure out what's important to people, and you can still figure out where their actual concerns are, and it will eliminate the noise of all the other stuff which end up being too polarizing to be able to reach a consensus.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said it better
Yeah.
myself. And I think one piece in all of this, and certainly one that I think a lot of our Indigenous people really understand, um, is this idea, which in the literature has been referred to as deliberation, which is a space that's created. Again, it's like creating the conditions for people to start making sense and processing information, um, so that they are able to join the dots. Um, so if you present, a community with a particular policy problem, um, the way they respond to that problem at the time you present it to them is quite different to the way they respond, 2 weeks from that, once you've given them the information and the data and um, the
Yes.
context around that. And so even having spaces, whether it's a virtual space or a physical space, where people can have the time and space to start making sense of information, is just so important, particularly now when we've got
Mm.
the digital world where everything kind of happens almost instantly. When we're almost deprived of that
Yes.
space needed to make sense of information.
We are. And, it's the way that the system is set up, because everything's in short form. We don't do long form anymore. And, because it's short form, people are overly concise. And when you're overly concise, you lose nuance. When you lose nuance, people start getting defensive if what you've said contradicts what they feel. And then, you just lead to arguments and people being more emotional than objective about the information that they are reading.
Yeah. And so I love what you said, because and that's, pretty much what the research suggests, which is, if you take away context around that, which is nuance to some degree, you're missing information, and that creates more misunderstandings and more tension in conversations. I think what's really important as well is understanding that emotional subjective piece is also just as valuable as that rational, objective piece. Um, the problem is
Yes.
we just don't know how to use that um, in conjunction with that objective and rational piece. But it doesn't mean that it's not
Yes.
important. It doesn't mean that someone
Hmm.
being subjective, um, that information is any less valuable than the objective information.
That's right. Because, it comes from a place where it does mean something to them. It's the tone, the way it hits the audience, that may not actually be conducive to further discourse.
And so how do we work with that, right? So it's almost like there's this source of information, which so Nora calls it warm data, and she runs these labs called warm data labs, so people start working with warm data. um, how
Yeah.
do we start working with warm data in a way to gather the insights that can be gleaned from that data, and then use those insights alongside our models and our cold data to produce a more considered, ecosystem kind of approach?
Yes. Well, that's the question, right? There's so many ways that we could approach it. But again, context. Everything comes back down to context and how we can apply it, or how we should apply it, and where we should apply it.
And I think it's needed now more than ever. It's almost like, we are just plowing ahead with AI and the cold data and the models, but that counterbalance, which is that warm data piece, is missing. And so,
Mm.
there's a part of me that thinks, look, at least when we had models that were simpler, and we didn't have as much information, we kind of got to consider the other side, right? We kind of got to say, well, there's that human factor, as there's the stuff that we weren't able to gather. There were limitations to our models. There's a whole bunch of assumptions that we've
Yes.
used. Um, but but now that things have gotten so much more precise, and models have gotten so much more sophisticated, I think it's even more important now to pay attention to that
Mm.
subjective and that warm data piece, because we could just be going
Yes.
completely off the rails. And even when we build our models, you get to pick your assumptions. You get to pick the premise of and the scope of that model, and when that model applies and doesn't apply. So it's almost like designing this engine that only you can drive and a few select people, because you know that if you picked an assumption that was a bit too far, the model would crash. Or and so you know even going to informing those assumptions and informing those limitations and that judgment piece, there's so much to be gained from that subjective warm data, that consultation, that speaking to that social service worker to get an idea from a data science perspective of how does that warm data, how does that inform the assumptions of my model, help me better understand the
Yes.
limitations of my model, help me understand when using this model is just not going to be appropriate, because
Yes.
you know because I now have a better understanding of the context around that.
exactly. But then again, how do you avoid imposing your own prejudices, your own bias, your own background into the model and inadvertently skewing or adjusting the situation around which it can work?
Yeah. But also being aware of that, right? Like, are we doing it anyway, but just don't have the awareness that that's actually what we are doing when we build models and design
Yes.
models. So the one of the things I really loved about warm data labs was that they happen within groups of people. And we, from a tech perspective, we understand that, you stack a whole bunch of CPUs together, you get this massive supercomputer, and we're sort of harnessing the power of technology and taking it to the next level. We haven't figured out how to do that with humans yet. And so, and I don't mean
No.
this in a sci-fi kind of, sci-fi kind of way. I mean, in terms
Plug
of,
them in,
yeah,
Matrix.
I don't quite mean it that way. I mean it more in terms of how do we think about knowledge systems within humans, and Indigenous people do this well, and
Mm,
thinking about what collective knowledge means to people, so that when we're building a model, we're not necessarily putting in an individual's assumptions, but it's almost done by the collective in a way that
yes.
is able to tap into the, the collective warm data. And so even this
Mm,
idea of human in the loop is about a singular human, or individuals, but we're missing that community piece in this. And again, this isn't just about consultation. It's about how do we really gather the wisdom of communities, whether it's local communities, um, and use that information to help build these models, rather than having a singular
yes.
developer, or just let's contract out an ethicist to come in and help us mitigate some of these harms, which I often cringe at, because I feel like mitigating is always something that you do after the damage has been done, not before.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so how do we think about better leveraging collective human intelligence?
You need the community engagement to be able to create systems to provide better community engagement. It's, again, chicken and egg.
So this entire conversation has just been a whole range of concentric circles, right? Objectivity,
Absolutely.
subjectivity, chickens and eggs.
Yes. Oh, it's it's not like humans are exactly an easy problem to solve.
No, but I kind of help wonder whether it's our view that it is something to solve, right? It's almost
Mm,
like going for a walk in a wild, you know, for a wild bushwalk, for example, and seeing nature,
yeah.
not in that orderly way that we expect everything to be, but in a way
Yeah.
that has dependencies that we aren't able
Mm.
to understand as being important. So we might think, hey, I'll just bring some foxes to Australia, and it'll all be good. Um, and it isn't, because of all the
No.
interdependencies. And I can't help but wonder whether we do the same thing to data, whether we
Mm.
you know in our quest to get to those insights and to get to solving those problems, we're so far deep into that we're not taking that step back and actually looking at that
Yeah.
information and seeing what is viable and what isn't, and where has that information, um, you know, how are we taking bits of information out of context, the foxes, and putting them into, putting that data into an environment that it's not suited to.
Yes. Absolutely. It's mm, there's so much there about the way that we do approach things. Like we've been talking about solving the problems, but society isn't solvable. Like that's not the way it should technically be approached. Humanity and the way that, we interact with each other isn't something that should be solved per se in the way that we do in a very scientific, technical way. Just because, that's not what we are. We are not the issue.
And we are as well, right? It's that paradox.
Yeah.
Where
Yes.
does the issue
Complete
begin and the
paradox.
human end?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Very interesting, very deep conversations and very deep issues that we do need to address. And yeah, I like the fact that, there's so many people trying to approach it in these different ways and, trying to, make sense of more of the way that our systems and our societies work. It's great.
Yeah. And so I think,
Yeah.
I often, I guess I would love to see a world where our technology was designed keeping in mind the other contexts around, not just the data, but even the environmental context and understanding, the political context, the ecological context. How do all these pieces go to even help like designing our models? How do we
Yeah.
anchor data? How do all these pieces come together? So it very much is, in my mind, it would be like a co-evolution of technology alongside nature, because tech is kind of like nature. I mean, it's made of, it's part of nature. And so how do we not create that separation between the map and that territory, but understand that it is all, there is all these interdependencies between.
I think a lot of the ways that we do approach things these days are starting to take these things into account. But, it's slow progress because, again, it's having to change the way that we approach the problems from conventional thought processes to, trying to adopt all these other ways of thinking. And, just our conversation talking about the interdependencies, about the ecosystems, and the fact that these are living systems makes me think of, talking to engineers who are working in international development because, they might be working on a specific thing, like in this particular case, water, sanitation, and health. So you're talking about, your public health infrastructure. But when you're talking about public health infrastructure, you also need to consider, the local development, the, in particular, women's menstrual cycles and toileting behaviors and how that impacts the local economy and, education level. And education level leads to more economic outcomes. And all of these are interrelated. So we went into a conversation going into talking about public plumbing and started talking about development and women's empowerment and trying to help communities have industries that can be sustained when you come in and do all these other things for developing their urban environment. Yeah, it's lots of moving parts.
Yeah, but exciting, right? And I think that's
It
part of
is.
the beauty of looking at an issue like that, because you've suddenly discovered how rich it is in context and how
Yes.
it's not, you're not going to be solving it in a series of specific interventions. You have to have that collective kind of ecosystem approach.
That's right. So many things to consider and so many exciting ways to approach them.
Shall we talk a little bit more about, warm data and a bit more around how those labs really help people make sense of an issue through different perspectives, and how that shift in perception um, allows them to view the world differently, which then means that they meet different societal issues and policy issues differently too. Um, and
Yes.
so, that piece, that is the warm data that I find quite interesting in terms of working, with that cold data, and how do we sort of have that consultation piece, which is, again, consultation feels like it's very removed from that main piece, right?
It
Um,
is. It feels a little bit too objective.
feels a little bit too objective. So how do we sort of, intertwine these two, so that it is one piece that we're looking at, a big one.
Yeah. So how do the warm data labs kind of approach that?
So with the warm data labs, it's not like there's a facilitator. It's very much about creating the right conditions for people by presenting the different contexts for them to start making sense of the world around them. Um, one of the pieces of work that I did was around thinking about human emotion, because that's a
Hmm.
big piece around, there's a lot of AI at the moment looking at how do we identify um, human behavior based on their facial disposition, or what does that say about the emotions, and then how can we use facial recognition technologies to decide, and there are applications out there, whether or not an individual is a suitable candidate for a job, right? So again, very
Mm.
controversial, huge, a
Yes,
huge ethical issue around that, um, and questions to be asked
absolutely.
behind how does someone, how do we even know that these, like the success rate around these algorithms, and what is the viability of that data in terms of human emotion? How can
Mm.
we then use a person's um, characteristics and the way they present themselves at an interview to determine whether or not they will stay in a particular job or shift jobs? Um,
Yes.
I think, again, this is that warm data, where warm data can be really helpful. It's about really
Mm.
understanding that. So there's two pieces in this. One is, understanding that everyone's emotions depend on, this huge under the water ocean, of what they've gone through in their life experiences. And we can't just flatten
Yes.
that down and have a reductionist approach in terms of, okay, that's what they look like, so they must be feeling like X, and that would mean they'd be a great employer when it comes to working with stakeholders. So it's not really that straightforward. Um, but but stepping out of that piece and understanding, okay, what's actually going on? What's going on is that there is a lot of data around, on applications that people have to apply for jobs. And organizations feel like they've been swamped with this information. So, how do they go through and decide? They run these algorithms across it. But understanding that, again, the solution to that problem may not come from within the employment context, but might actually come from, an educational context, or a context around, benefits or family. So
Mm.
bringing in those extra contextual pieces and saying, look, to employers, um, if you use that technology, here are the downsides, or here are the impacts, that you may not have considered to your own organization, because what you're essentially doing is hiring a certain type of individual, and you could potentially be,
Yes.
um, you know, stopping, almost filtering out individuals who could be really creative or could be really innovative for those particular roles. And again, that's going, beyond that moral, inclusion and diversity piece. It's very much talking to, the,
Mm.
back to our initial thing about the resilience piece, looking at that resilience in there.
Yes. Exactly. And because the algorithm is designed to function in that specific way, you, yeah, as you said, you end up hiring to type. And you're not allowing the case by case kind of assessment of the individual. And sort of related, unrelated, a friend shared with me, a neuroscientist who developed an app called the Hippo camera to help people with Alzheimer's kind of reinforce memories that they're losing. So you record
Oh,
an event and encourage them to play it back to try and reinforce the memory, because that's the bit that's affected by Alzheimer's. But then I was thinking about the way that we handle like the tech that's leading to compassionate tech, and compassionate tech needs to have that context in order to be compassionate.
yeah. Wow.
And there's a woman who, it's not compassionate tech in the way that I perceived it, but it's talking about compassion in tech and the way that we interact with our industry. And this would apply to all other technical industries as well, and the way that we approach being human to other people, because these fields are also not very compassionate, because we are very technical, we are very
Yeah.
clinical, we can be very cold. And the way that we treat each other, the way we treat our users or our customers becomes very clinical because we treat them like data.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's just talking about the way that we need to,
Yeah.
be considerate of all those other factors as well. And warm data labs would help contribute
Yeah.
to compassionate tech.
Gosh, that's huge.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I've got goosebumps listening to you. Honestly, I could talk to you all night. Honestly, it's just you've hit
Yes.
the nail on the head. I think particularly when it comes to the hard sciences and really technical fields, there's so much of our lives that is invested and in those particular paradigms that it becomes
Mm.
difficult to almost step away from that data and not have that tunnel vision,
Yeah.
and realize that those numbers
Mm.
refer to these people who have not
Yes.
been fed and are not just bums because they don't want to accept the housing, but there's a real issue there that we haven't got information about,
Yeah.
like the pets. So I think, I think to your point too, I think, and this is why I really wanted to step into this space, was to bring that warm data piece. I liken it to muscles, like soft skills. People say, oh,
Mm.
well, let's not call communication skills soft skills anymore. They're just as
Yeah.
valuable. And of course they are. But I don't have a problem with the word soft, because if you look at the human physiology, for example, we've got a skeleton, but no one could
Yes.
deny that the muscles and the tendons are important. It's like, yeah, good luck with your skeleton. You're going to need the tissue and everything else, and that's soft. But
Yeah.
there isn't a judgment there that one is
Mm.
better than the other and one is preferable compared to the other.
Yeah.
But when it comes
It's all
to
complementary.
data and science and information, there's a judgment there about how
Yeah.
we view the hard sciences. And I really think it's about reproducibility and this
Mm.
ideal we have as a community, that if we can all agree to something, that makes it better than if we disagree. So
Yes.
if we all measure the temperature today and that's the temperature, we all agree with it, it's like, yes, that's the truth. But it may not, but an incident is someone else's truth. And you said that beautifully in the
Yes.
podcast, that it is real to that person, it has value to that person. But it
Mm.
doesn't mean that that information isn't valuable in that.
Yes.
So why do we do that? Why do we push that aside? And I think the only reason is convenience. It's because we don't know
Mm.
how to process subjective data. We know how to
Yes.
process objective data and build models, and we know how to build from that. But we don't know how to build from stuff that's subjective.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, I love talking to you,
It's
Michelle.
yeah. Oh, me
Yeah.
too.
Thank you so much for
Yes.
this. It's been such a treat, such a treat.
Oh, it really has been. I've really enjoyed this. So, if you want to have another chat, let me know. So, yeah, we can do the wind up part. Okay. So, let's see. Soft questions. So, what hobby or interest do you have that's most unrelated to your field of work?
I say everything's interrelated and be a bit cheeky. I love, I have a newfound passion in cybernetics, but that's kind of related to
Yes.
my passion around better understanding data AI and data science, but it's about,
Absolutely.
really looking at nature and understanding information flows and how information
Yes.
evolves and information is changed, um, and how living systems respond to different types of stimuli and information. Because I think,
Hmm.
if we are to better understand one another and understand our systems, um, and even understand, where AI is appropriate and isn't appropriate, we need to understand the information and the data that sort of underlies those models and the viability of that data.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated by information and how people make sense of the world, how they process that information, what it means to them, but even how information is, propagandized. Like, where does that communication piece? How does that fit in with ideas around democracy, and how does it shape the way we look at important world issues as well? So cybernetics would be my
Absolutely.
my you know my topic of choice.
Very philosophical, though, because it is, a lot of the deeper questions about, you know, why we are the way we are. And it's very interesting psychologically and anthropologically. It's, yeah, just because we are very complex beings. And it's fascinating to see why, one person responds a certain way under certain conditions. And, you know, I've, I've always had issues with psychometric testing because every question I want to say, well, it depends.
It all depends on the
And it's,
context, she
yeah,
says.
it is. It absolutely is. And so, they tell you to do those MBTIs and all those other personality tests. It's like, well, yes, I'm more one way than another, but it does depend on the circumstances you're putting me in. And, under certain situations, I will respond very differently. And even coming back to that, um, with psychometric testing and all these standardized tests, there's a lot of bias in the way that they're standardized. And just looking at uh, standard literacy tests, for example, many of them, and I don't know if that's still the case now, but a while ago, a lot of the standardized tests were very dependent on idioms. And it's like, well, unless you grew up in a Commonwealth country and went through an English Commonwealth education, a lot of these idioms don't make any sense to you. And you'd have no basis for understanding why those idioms exist. So you will automatically fail that component of the test because your educational environment or your cultural environment doesn't match. And so you end up, again, passing to type as opposed to
Yeah.
actually getting a formal assessment of whether someone is literate. So,
I
yeah,
find it
context.
fascinating. I find your example fascinating because from a data perspective, you'd say, well, that was just, that was bias. But that's bias we
Mm,
recognize, right? That you have
yeah.
identified. What about the biases that we haven't yet identified? And,
Mm,
it's it's one thing to say, look, this is the outcome that we want. It's another thing to say that this is the outcome that we want that will solve the problem. Because often the outcomes, so even if we get the outcomes that we're striving for and meet those targets, it doesn't mean that's the solution to the problem,
no, it's not.
does it?
No. You're solving for criteria, but not actually achieving the effective solution. Is there anything in particular that, fascinates you about something that you've researched so far in cybernetics?
I'm still going through Gregory Bateson's books. Mind and Nature is one that I'd highly recommend, and he's got such a really engaging conversational style. Um, highly recommend reading that one. Um, the other one I love to read is a book by Kevin Kelly. It's called Out of Control. It's an old one, but it's one that I find fascinating again because he looks at this um, connection between machines and nature again. So you're
Yes.
seeing a theme here, Michelle. It's like, I seem to gravitate to that space in between nature and machines. And I think
Yes.
I think I might have been robbed as a child, having to pick between those two paths, whether I wanted to go down the biology route or whether I wanted to choose physics.
Absolutely.
And so I feel like I get a second chance to um, close that loop in a way by starting off from the physics
Yeah.
side, wandering into the public policy piece, getting lost in the AI weeds, and now, trying to come back to better understanding nature.
Yes. And I mean, it all started with physics, where you were studying signals in communication anyway.
Yeah,
It's just a
the
different
irony,
medium.
right?
I know. Absolutely full circle. Okay. And which childhood book holds the strongest memories for you?
Oh, I'm going to refrain from using fiction because there's a lot of books that I read as a child that I had to read, and I didn't understand the wisdom until much later. But and I wouldn't say this is a childhood book, but I used to have this book with science facts, and I loved reading the marine biology section. If I wasn't going to be a physicist, I was going to be a marine biologist, except for the fact that I wasn't very good at swimming. Um, and so, the choice was made. So I think I was very much a non-fictional reader, and it's interesting because I emphasize a lot to my son about the importance of the creative arts and understanding, reading
Yes.
poems and literature, um, because of that subjective piece, because of having understood the need to have that balance in the objective and subjective, and having those, bringing
Mm.
different perspectives to a problem. Um, yeah, it's so Gregory Bateson talks about this example, and I'm sort of diverging here a little, where he says, and I could be getting this wrong, but it's my interpretation of it. If you look at it, like if you close one eye and you see this image in front of you, which is through just one eye, and then you swap, you open up the other eye, what you see are two different images. But when you look at an image through both your eyes, what you're now seeing is depth. And so
Yes.
depth is a dimension that wasn't present in either the right eye view or the left eye
Mm.
view. But as a result of looking at both those views at the same time. So what we've
Yes.
done is we've taken data set A and data set B. Think about your Venn diagram. But this is kind of, blows your mind, because the information you now perceive with both your eyes is in neither, so the dimension aspect is in neither one nor the other, but as a result of
Yes.
the two. Um, so
Yes.
it could just be,
That's a wonderful
me finding
metaphor.
this amazing. But when I read it, I was like, whoa. Here is an idea, here's an example of different contexts coming together to provide different
Yeah.
dimensionality to information.
Yeah. And it's literally providing different dimensionality. And it's such a brilliant metaphor to explain the concept of the need for context to provide depth. It's beautifully illustrated, very elegant.
Yeah. So I'd recommend read Gregory Bateson's Mind and Nature. Probably not childhood. Probably a bit advanced, but
Advanced reading. Yeah. But it is about encouraging a wide range of reading to provide more perspective, more depth, and
yeah.
more richness in your understanding of the way things work. So it's wonderful. And lastly, what advice would you give someone who would like to do what you do, and what advice should they ignore?
The advice I would give someone would be to dive into as many different things as possible. So the big lesson I've been learning on my journey, is that no information is really wasted. Like, I learned physics. I then moved into economics, public policy, um, And it's amazing how what you're really doing is you're seeing the world around you through those different lenses. And by
Yes.
doing that, you're getting a new kind of depth that you would not have been able to get had you just stayed in the one place. And so I'd say, I'd welcome the different types of roles and jobs that come along and the different learnings that fascinate you, because I think it just makes for a richer view of the world.
Yes.
And what I would suggest you ignore was that the second question, the second part of that question.
Yes.
Um,
That's right.
and this is more, advice more than anything would be ignore any limitations that people um, put on you in terms of what you can and can't do. Um, I I loved physics, so I started out as a physicist, um, but it wasn't without its struggles. I wasn't the top student in many areas, but I think I just did it because I loved it. I didn't think I'd be awesome at it. And then when I went to doing public policy again, it was like an eye opener for me that someone who did a physics degree would want to do something different after having done as much study as I have. Um, so I think being brave enough to step outside your comfort zone, and ignoring what people say about what is best for you because they don't have the context that you have on your own life, is always a good thing.
Yes.
So ignore the naysayers. enjoy the learning.
Absolutely. And, there's such a wealth of information out there that just enriches our entire experience no matter what we're doing. So there's really nothing to lose in being a bit more adventurous and brave in these things.
And it's okay to make mistakes, right? Like
It is, yeah.
I think that's part of the learning as well. That it's inevitable that everyone's going to fall and stumble at some point. Um, but that's also what makes the journey exciting. You'll make mistakes, and that's part of the learning. Um,
It is. It makes you more resilient.
yes. Back to resilience.
Yes,
We finish off with resilience. I love
exactly. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Audrey. This has been such an amazing conversation that we've had today, and so many deep questions, so many philosophical questions that, we haven't answered exactly, but, ones that we need to consider. And, maybe we'll find other people who are able to help us get us closer to that answer. So, if people would like to know more about what you do and your work, where can they go?
Check out my Medium site, Audrey Lobo-Pulo. And yeah, that's where I publish my latest blogs and thinking around anything in that in between space, in between um, tech and nature, and tech and
I love that how you describe your work as a liminal technologist. Like it's just, it's perfect. That's exactly, you know, bridging everything, bridging all of the different interrelated topics together.
it's an exciting place to be, Michelle. I highly encourage anyone wanting to venture into that space.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for sharing, your stories too. I think makes for such an exciting conversation when we're both able to bring different pieces together and really enrich the discussion. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you. I've really appreciated, having this wonderful, rich conversation. It's been such a pleasure speaking with Audrey today about some very philosophical matters around data, algorithms, and how we apply these concepts to humans and humanity. To learn more about Audrey and what we discuss on the show, or to connect with us, please visit the Steampowered website at steampoweredshow.com. You can also read more of Audrey's work on Medium, the link for which will be in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, and share this with your geeky or geek-curious friends. You can also support Steampowered on Patreon and Ko-fi, the links for which will also be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Stick around for a little bonus content.
Yeah, I hope it's useful to your audience too, because I realize a lot of it was very. I try to make it real because I really think
Yeah.
I know in my bones that it's real, but it
Mm.
sounds philosophical. So I've had discussions, with analysts, and ultimately it comes to this philosophical question, which is, can everything be measured or can't it? And there's two
Yes.
camps in that. There are people who say that every single thing can be measured, and I fall in the other camp, which is you can't measure everything because the process of measurement itself is objectifying something,
Yep.
right? Because that's the process of measuring it. And
Yes.
so,
You're taking a truth at this point in
yes,
time,
yes,
and that's only contextual and chronological. Like it's just that point in
yeah.
time.
And even,
Yeah.
memories, like you talked about memories and compassionate, computing and tech. My memory of my childhood now is so different to my memory of my childhood even 10 years ago. It's the
Yes.
same data, but the way I perceive it is so different now. And I can't help but feel fear when I think about memories being collected by an algorithm where those memories don't change, right? That is
Yes.
it's static to some degree. Um, but me being a human, I have the prerogative to look back at a fight I had with a sibling and feel really angry and indignated, and
In,
yet down the track feel guilty about this exact same situation, the same data, but have a completely different response to it, um, as I would have
yeah.
at the time. And so again, it's that what's changed between then. The incident was the same, it happened at the same time. It is my sense making capacity
Yes.
that is changing the quality is not even the right word, changing the information, right?
It is. And that's one thing that people talk about, the fact that because our memories are not immutable, it's all entirely different dependent on context,
Yeah.
and the way that we develop as human beings, because over time we gather additional information that will inform those memories in different ways. There's this book, I'm still reading it because there's a lot in it. It's called The Ego Trick by Julian Baggini, and it talks about ego, the way that we think about who we are. And the blurb is, are you who you are 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, or a year ago? Because in that time, things happen, like, I'm oversimplifying. In that time, things happen that change your perspective on things, that change the way you experience things or
Yeah.
how you feel about
Massive.
things. So your memories are who you are and form who you are, but not all that you are, because they've just led you on that journey while
Powerful.
you're changing who you are.
That is so
And
powerful. Wow.
it is.
Yeah.
It's such a great book, and yeah, it's still going. So a fairly hefty book, um, but yeah, it when you try to measure people in that way or measure things in that way, you can't. Yeah, it's never going to be completely measurable because people change, because how the people feel about their memories change, and it's yeah,
It's that sense making.